Oh.
Mhm.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're just going to wait a couple seconds for persons on the webinar to file.
Yeah, I started.
Just asking, yes, thanks. Okay. Okay. Welcome, everyone. We'll get started, even if I know persons are still joining, but we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So let me start as director of the Sridas Rampal Center by welcoming you all to this first of our series entitled the SRC Virtual Series on Trade and Investment Research. We are so excited to add this to our offerings. So as you know, the SRC has already done work in promoting our research through outreach events such as the SRC Lunchtime Chat and all these other events. We have our SRC Trading Thoughts, but we decided that it was time for us to expand our reach to more research-related work and deliverables, and in particular to showcase and provide a forum for some of the wonderful work that our students under the MITP, the Masters in Trade Policy program, are doing. So this forum is actually meant not just to showcase the research of our students under the MITP, but also more generally research coming out of the region, as well as research internationally, where we learn from seasoned researchers, as well as postdoc or graduate students from the region, but also beyond. And we want to engage in critical thinking about the aspects of the Caribbean trade policy, whether it's from an economic, interdisciplinary, or legal perspective. And that extends to the areas within our ambit at the SRC, which is just not trade, but equally investment and all of the interlocking things that are happening in that space. So whether it's trade in terms of the old mercantilist view of trade liberalization, but equally thinking about the new interconnections between trade and sustainability and development policy. So we are really, really pleased to have you. I'll take 1 minute to actually share my screen and show you where you will be able to, in the future, understand a little bit more of the virtual trade and investment series on our website. It's available here under the outreach tab. It sets out the specific objectives. There's a little introduction by myself. And as you can see, the first of these series is being kind of covering the topic of post-COVID-19 development, in particular looking at industrial policy and tourism. Now, I'm really excited to hand over for the rest of today's event to Alicia Nichols, our Trade Research Fellow, who actually came up with this idea for the series and who have asked to actually run it. And so I'm really pleased to be able to send it over now to Alicia, who will do the introductions and moderate the event. So over to you, Alicia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Remy. I really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to have you with us. As my director said, my name is Alicia Nichols. I'm the Junior Research Fellow here at the SRC. And it is my pleasure to moderate this evening's session. I hope everyone is hearing me okay. This evening, I am particularly happy because we have two of our two top MITP graduates presenting their papers this evening. They were both excellent students. They're both very accomplished ladies in their respective careers. And of course, I'll be introducing them shortly. So Miss Allison St. Bryce is a recent graduate of the SRC's MITP program, and she's keenly interested in exploring ways in which trade could effectively be leveraged in the pursuit of sustainable development. And our second presenter this evening is Mrs. Adrienne Brathwaite Green, who is a statistician and a recent graduate of the Masters in International Trade program as well, same part of the trade. And they will start off this evening with Ms. St. Bryce. I'll hand over to her, and her topic is considerations on a revitalized industrial policy framework for export diversification in Trinidad and Tobago. Allison.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm just checking to see whether you can see my presentation.
Hear you perfectly, Allison, and we could see your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So first, I want to thank the SRC for this opportunity, and I also want to extend special thanks to both Ms. Celicia Nichols and Dr. Johnny Rami for their outreach to both Adrienne and to me, as well as for their guidance. Thanks as well to Dr. Keith Nurse for agreeing to be our discussant today, and to everyone who has joined us for this discussion. I will start by confessing that when I completed and submitted this paper, I had a very cathartic good riddance moment, and I pressed on with my life. And so it's been a bit of a challenge trying to get back into this mental space to prepare for today. I know a number of you online can identify with just what I just described in terms of the time spent reading articles, writing, spending an eternity on your citations and bibliography. And I know that that moment that you hit send is one in which you feel huge relief to be released from the torture of it all. But I have discovered that if the topic is one that you're interested in and even passionate about, it's something that you will end up coming back to at some point. And well, here am I. And well, okay, so my paper looks at industrial policy and the possibilities as a revitalized approach to industrial policy holds for dynamizing export diversification efforts in Trinidad and Tobago. And I've placed my research question on screen. You can have a look and read it of that question. On the qualifier revitalized, I want to explain that I've used it both as an acknowledgement that industrial policy is not a novelty in Trinidad and Tobago. The deployment of industrial policy, it's not something new. And I've also used it as a means of highlighting that deliberate changes in the approach to industrial policy could perhaps make all the difference. Now for some definitions. By and large, in this paper, industrial policy is used to refer to any type of government intervention in the economy that aims to boost productivity and economic growth. And I've also included on the screen an amplified definition based on a Ken Warwick paper. I'll give a little moment for you to read that through. But I would also like to highlight the emphasis on government intervention with a view to ensuring that there are better prospects for economic growth. So the government intervenes to improve the business environment and the structure of economic activity. I wanted to also clarify a particular point because the paper recognizes that industrial policy deployment is not exclusively in relation to agriculture, not exclusively in relation to industry, but could extend to agriculture and services. But nevertheless, the term is often used in this paper to refer to industry in particular and manufacturing-led, a manufacturing-focused industrial policy. So I just wanted to make those clarifications before proceeding. So why write on industrial policy? I think if we look at the pre-pandemic era, we would see that even before the COVID-19 pandemic, industrial policy was being deployed in a range of economies, whether developed, developing, small, big, market-oriented, or otherwise. And these measures were being used in the pursuit of trade, economic, and sustainable development objectives. In fact, an UNCTAD 2018 World Investment Report notes that 84 countries at that time, accounting for 90% of global GDP, were using industrial policy measures. So even pre-pandemic, and notwithstanding the prevalence of the neoliberal world order, which emphasizes the primacy of markets, industrial policy characterized by government intervention in the economy was becoming increasingly acceptable as a legitimate policy approach in a range of countries. China comes to mind, the USA, Chile, Republic of South Korea, even the EU. And of course, I must qualify that statement by acknowledging that there's a notable difference in pre-pandemic industrial policy deployment as compared to earlier on, like say the 1940s, when there was an emphasis on import substitution industrialization and infant industry protection as key features of industrial policy deployment. And then with the pandemic, we all know what happened when the pandemic came along. It exposed the fragility of many of our economies, our developing economies. We saw the introduction of export restrictions. We saw the disruption of global supply chains. And these elements, among others, highlighted the vulnerabilities associated with heavy reliance on imports and the urgent need to boost domestic productive capacity. In the case of Trinidad and Tobago in particular, the pandemic reinforced the imperative to diversify the economy away from heavy reliance on the energy sector and on energy exports. And then we can look to the wider CARICOM and the impact of the pandemic on the economies within the Caribbean community. And I want to mention that notwithstanding what is outlined in Article 51 and 52 of the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas, there has been limited progress with respect to the outlining of an industrial policy for the community to date. And so the pandemic seems to be a trigger for the momentum that we are seeing today, the pandemic, as well as the intersecting and cascading crises that we are experiencing now relating to food, energy, fertilizer, cost of living more broadly, the climate crisis. And we're seeing a renewed interest in the community, including, and most prominently, a renewed interest among our leaders, because in March 2022, we see that Suriname was assigned lead responsibility on industrial policy within the community. And the Conference of Heads of Government also agreed in July 2022 to the establishment of a ministerial task force and a technical working group on industrial policy. So that's just spending a little while on why this topic is important. So for me, this has not been just an academic exercise. This paper has a utilitarian intent. It aims to provide high-level decision makers in Trinidad and Tobago with an assessment of the merits and the limitations of industrial policy as a viable tool for accelerating the progress of efforts to achieve export diversification goals in the pursuit of sustainable development. It also outlines key elements for a revitalized industrial policy framework for Trinidad and Tobago and provides recommendations for next steps. Now to get into a bit on my process, I've included some keywords on the screen related to my methodology. For this research paper, I mainly used qualitative approaches and I relied heavily on secondary sources in the conduct of desk research. I used national development plans, policy documents, online statistical databases, for example, of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago and of the World Bank. This paper features a theoretical framework and a literature review, a case study, and a pestle analysis. Now, a word on the theoretical framework. The paper interrogates and counters narratives relating to the incompatibility of industrial policy deployment with the neoliberal global order. and it acknowledges the challenges in terms of defining neoliberalism. But we know that it's characterized by the primacy and self-regulation of markets and the open world economy. And I've outlined a number of other elements here on this slide. Another key element of the theoretical framework comes from a claim outlined in a UNIDO publication from 2013, which posits that that there's a positive correlation between manufacturing-focused industrial policy interventions and the achievement of productivity and economic growth in economies beneath a certain income level. And this is a key consideration for this paper. Now, to look a bit at my literature review, I've placed some keywords on this slide. The literature review engaged with scholarship relating to the resource case, structural economic transformation, research and development, export diversification. And on this slide, I've highlighted some of the key authors that I read and engaged with in the paper. So Danny Roderick, Ken Warwick, Carl Aginger, the UNIDO publication that I just mentioned, and Roger Hussein and et al. On the Dutch disease. So to step back a little bit and to look, I wanted to spend a little time looking at an outline of the paper. As I said, it includes a literature review and a theoretical framework. Another chapter places present-day export diversification and industrial policy approaches in Trinidad and Tobago in historical perspective and in regional perspective. Another chapter incorporates a case study, and this case study looks at industrial policy in Mauritius, a similarly situated small island developing state, and possible implications for Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll go into a bit more detail on this particular chapter. It examines Mauritius's industrial policy and strategic plan for the period 2020 to 2025. And this was outlined by the government of Mauritius in collaboration with UNCTAD during the pandemic. And it bears noting that this plan has a very specific development goal, namely to attain high income status for Mauritius by 2030. And despite being a services-based economy, this plan places manufacturing at the heart of industrial policy approaches, with the understanding that manufacturing-led industrial policy interventions would be important for achieving the enviable growth secured by countries like China, for example. And then moving on to the results and discussion chapter, it outlines key elements for the elaboration of an effective industrial policy framework. It also includes a PESTEL analysis, which seeks to gauge the conduciveness of the political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal context in Trinidad and Tobago to effective industrial policy deployment. And then, of course, the final chapter outlines some recommendations and some recommendations for the way forward. Just to touch briefly on two limitations. One is that notwithstanding the many similarities between Mauritius and Trinidad and Tobago, there are evidently differences between both countries and the circumstances therein. And so it would not be possible to it would not be wise or prudent to seek to extrapolate the Mauritius experience into the context of Trinidad and Tobago, but of course there are lessons that we can glean from the example of Mauritius. And also in terms of the PESTEL analysis, I note that it's typically used by firms to assess opportunities and challenges of a business environment. And so there were a few kinks in terms of repurposing that tool for this exercise. So coming down to the end of this presentation now, I wanted to highlight some of the findings. So through having engaged with the literature and having looked at the case of Mauritius, the paper outlines some certain elements that should feature in our industrial policy framework in this case, it's for Trinidad and Tobago, but more broadly speaking, based on what we see in the literature. And there on the screen, I've just highlighted a few. One is something that I've been saying throughout this presentation, like placing manufacturing at the heart of any industrial policy framework. There's also an emphasis on skills development, upgrading, and attraction within the framework. And the need for robust monitoring and evaluation mechanisms. And now moving on to the different recommendations that were outlined in the final chapter of the paper. In the first instance, I concluded that yes, it would be worth the while of the high-level decision makers and policy makers in Trinidad and Tobago to dedicate resources at this time and to seek technical support for the elaboration of a revitalized industrial policy framework. I also suggest in the paper that it would be wise to assign responsibility for industrial policy to a political figure, and this is a recommendation that we see in a number of the different articles on the subject. Just for political buy-in, for accountability, it's a recommendation that is repeated. I wouldn't say ad nauseum, but very often. The emphasis on the green transition and digital transformation within that industrial policy framework is something that I would want to highlight. And finally, I would like to highlight the last recommendation on leveraging regional cooperation on industrial policy, specifically using the current momentum within the Caribbean community as a means of propelling forward national efforts, domestic efforts in Trinidad and Tobago to outline an industrial policy framework and identify specific measures. So thank you for patiently listening to all of that. And I would now give the floor to Jen.
Thank you so much, Alison. Our next speaker would be Miss Adrienne Brathwaite Green, whose topic is Chain Hotels and Tourism Destination Competition in the Organization of Eastern Caribbean Member States. Adrienne, over to you.
Thank you, Alicia. And before I begin, I would like to add to Alison's introductory sentiments of thanks to both yourself and Dr. Remy and Dr. Nurse for having us today. And thank you to all of the participants who are here to share with us today. Okay, I hope that everyone can see my screen.
Yep, confirming that we could see your screen.
All right.
And it's in full slide mode, so you're good.
Okay, awesome. Today, it's my pleasure to present to you my research under the topic, an investigation into the impact of chain hotels on tourism destination competitiveness in the Eastern Caribbean region. My paper sought to answer the question, how does the presence of chain hotels impact tourism competitiveness in the Eastern Caribbean region? Now, as a national of the Eastern Caribbean island of Grenada, I have long been aware of the importance of tourism to both our economy and to those of our regional neighbors. While I am also conscious of and fully support the increasing calls for diversification of our export portfolios to reduce dependence on the sometimes often volatile tourism sector, I remain cognizant of the fact that in a typical year, tourism and its related activities account for 34% of regional GDP and provides employment for a significant portion of the labor force. It is therefore imperative that member states achieve competitive advantage by ensuring that their overall tourism product is superior to that offered by other competing destinations. And this is particularly important in light of the economic devastation our islands experience due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Thus, the concept of tourism destination competitiveness, which I will from here on refer to as TDC, should be of particular importance to the region. Going even further, I say that it is clear that it is of utmost importance to ensure that all sector participants, institutions, and the related governmental policies contribute to increasing the competitiveness of our region's tourism product. Additionally, it has become standard practice for governments to grant significant duty concessions, long-term tax waivers, and prime real estate to large chain resorts seeking to operate in their countries. And such allowances are often justified by claims that the expected benefits to the country and its tourism product far outweigh the revenue and property foregone. I found it noteworthy that despite such justifications, I was unable to find even one regional study aimed at proving the veracity of these claims. I therefore felt that it was prudent to undertake such an investigation, targeted at determining exactly what impact the presence of chain hotels has on regional destination competitiveness. Now, research into the competitiveness of a tourist destination has as its theoretical foundation the parent concept of competitiveness. The first studies on competitiveness can be traced back to 1980, when Michael Porter defined it as resulting from superior productivity, either in terms of lower costs than rivals or the ability of a firm to offer products with superior values that justifies premium price. It is a concept that is both relative and multidimensional, and it was found to be applicable at the firm, industry, or country level. This complexity is the reason why competitiveness is generally evaluated based on the performance pattern in several dimensions rather than that of a single dimension. When it comes to competitiveness of a tourist destination, this is a concept that has been widely researched over the course of the last 2 decades. And as such, there are several, oftentimes divergent definitions. I have placed on the screen several of those because time constraints won't allow me to go into all of them. But despite the divergence in definitions, there are 3 basic dimensions that were found to be present in almost all definitions. Those 3 are economic competitiveness, which is indisputably the central facet of TDC, attractiveness and satisfaction, which speaks to the ability of a destination to draw and satisfy its tourists, and finally, sustainability, which includes the environmental and social aspects of destinations. When it comes to measuring destination competitiveness, the most widely used measure of tourism competitiveness is the World Economic Forum's Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Index, or TTCI, which ranks the main tourist destinations in the world by evaluating the factors and policies that are deemed to render a destination attractive to international tourism and that enable the sustainable development of the travel and tourism sector, all while contributing to the development and competitiveness of the host country. The index is based upon 90 indicators that measure varying dimensions of competitiveness. There are 4 sub-indexes under which 14 pillars are distributed, and the 90 indicators are grouped under these 4 sub-indexes, as you can see on the screen. The 4 sub-indexes are enabling environment, travel and tourism policy and enabling conditions, infrastructure, and natural and cultural resources. Now, chain hotels are considered to be a crucial element of the tourism ecosystem, and they influence the competitiveness of a destination in numerous ways. My research uncovered that the first and arguably the most important way by which chain hotels do this is through increased market visibility, which is accomplished when the destination is included on the websites of the chain hotels, global distribution systems, and their online travel agents. A second way is through the improvement of human resources in the local hospitality sector through training programs and internships. And finally, the introduction of innovative ICT was found to be another way in which chain hotels contribute to TDC. In terms of the methodology, I sought to achieve the overarching aim of my paper by utilizing a mixed methodology approach. Quantitative analysis in the form of a cross-section regression model was performed to obtain a statistical measure of the impact of chain hotels on destination competitiveness. The model was closely patterned on the one used by Ivanov and Ivanova in their 2016 paper entitled, "Do Hotel Chains Stimulate Globalization?" Following their theoretical framework, a cross-section regression analysis of the 6 Eastern Caribbean countries for whom data was available was performed using the statistical software Stata. Cross-section regression was the chosen method due to lack of availability of data for extended time periods, and also because the selected measure of destination competitiveness was only available for the year 2015 for our countries. Now, while I acknowledge that a panel data approach would have been the ideal method, it was not feasible due to the previously mentioned data inadequacies. Secondary data was collected from key data producers in order to perform the regression models. The measure of tourism destination competitiveness that was used was one developed in 2021 by Leon Perez and a team of researchers. Though the TTCI would have been the preferred measure, none of our islands are ranked on it, and therefore I was not able to use it. It is noteworthy, however, that the results of Perez's work were found to be consistent with the TTCI outputs and therefore constitute a more than adequate proxy. To model the market presence of hotels, the variables, number of chain hotels, number of rooms in chain hotels, share of chain hotels, and share of chain hotel rooms were used. The Swiss Economic Institute's Globalization Index and the World Bank's Doing Business ranking were also used to capture the level of globalization and the overall business environment of the Eastern Caribbean countries. Other variables used in the model included total tourism receipts, destination GDP, share of tourism receipts in destination GDP, population, GDP per capita, and the Consumer Price Index. And these were chosen because previous studies found that they all impact destination competitiveness in a significant way. In addition, I used a dummy variable, which was the presence of or absence of an international airport. My motivation for including this variable was that not all Eastern Caribbean islands have international airports, and I believe that the associated increase in travel times and cost associated with the lack of an international airport in an island could negatively affect TDC, and so I wanted to get a statistical measure of that. For the qualitative analysis, a case study on the contribution of the Sandals Hotel to destination competitiveness in Grenada was undertaken. Interviews were conducted with key stakeholders and data compilers to ascertain the overall contribution of the resort to TDC in Grenada, and secondary data was also sourced from the relevant authorities. In terms of the results, now I should state that as a precursor to performing the regression, a correlation analysis was done. And this is standard practice to provide a summary of the direction and strength of the relationship between destination competitiveness and the variables of the model. The levels of correlation between destination competitiveness and the variables representing tourism's share of GDP and GDP per capita were found to be very high, positive, and statistically significant at the 10% level. And what this indicates is that the higher the share of tourism receipts as a percentage of GDP in an Eastern Caribbean island, the higher the per capita income of that island, the greater the competitiveness of the destination would be. Regarding tourism's share of GDP, that outcome was expected, as the higher tourism share of GDP is, the greater the importance that would be assigned to ensuring that the industry thrives. If governments see that tourism is one of the best performing sectors, they are more likely to invest in the sector's improvement. Conversely, as Eastern Caribbean economies are highly prone to exogenous shocks and climate change, which negatively impact their earning potential, the heavy focus on traditional tourism can be disastrous when events occur that impact their GDP. And so one of the findings of the paper was that it is imperative that destinations seek to diversify even their tourism portfolio. All other variables were found by the correlation analysis to be statistically insignificant. Now, as we get to the regression models, all 12 regression models returned statistically insignificant coefficients for all variables. But according to Vicentin, who wrote in 2019, what this means is that although the null hypothesis, which in this case is that the presence of hotel chains does not impact tourism destination competitiveness, may be true, there is not enough evidence to either support or reject it. And this is attributable to one of three reasons. It can be that the mean difference may be too small, the variation in groupings may be too large, or the sample size may be too small. And given that the data limitations that I spoke of earlier allowed for only 1 year to be included in the model, the evidence points to the fact that the sample size was simply too small. Thus, the model lacked the necessary power to detect statistically significant results and relationships between the independent variables and destination competitiveness. Additionally, as the Eastern Caribbean countries all have similar profiles, this further affected the ability of the model to make statistically significant inferences, as regression models rely on differences in observations to establish patterns. This, however, did not mean that inferences could not be made, as following once more the pattern set by Ivanov and Ivanova, who were able to draw inferences from the signs of the regression coefficients of otherwise insignificant results, I was able to perform an analysis of my results, which I will outline to you now. 8 of the 12 models showed that the doing business ranking of an island is positively related to its destination competitiveness, thus showing that the higher an island's doing business score, the more attractive it is for a tourism investor to begin operations in the destination, which in turn can contribute to increasing that island's TDC. The Consumer Price Index was also found to be positively related to TDC in all 12 models. This was also the case in Ivanov and Ivanova's study, and while on balance, this result might appear to be counterintuitive, as the level of the consumer price index is a representation of the inflation in a destination. One possible explanation is that the prices of goods and services basically remain at a level that tourists are comfortable with due to the exchange rate differences, because we know that most of our source markets are countries that have a higher exchange rate than we do. So that allows for tourists to come and still be comfortable with the level of prices in our countries. Another possible explanation was found to be that low or negative inflation is often a sign of economic stagnation, and therefore decreases in the CPI could be indicative of economic decline, which is known to negatively impact TDC. The variable representing the presence of or absence of an international airport was unfortunately omitted from all 12 models by the software, but it was expected to have had an impact on the competitiveness of a destination in the Eastern Caribbean, as the number and types of flights into a destination depend heavily on whether it has an international airport. So it was expected that islands with international airports would have more international flights, whereas those without would have few, if any, international flights and would have to rely on the smaller regional carriers to transport international travelers from nearby hub islands, which would result in longer flight times and greater expense, which of course intuitively would negatively affect TDC as it reduces the ease of travel into the destination. Unfortunately, since no results were able to be obtained for this variable due to data insufficiency, a recommendation was that future, more robust models include that variable to test the relationship. The most important for this research variables of the model returned inconclusive results, as there was an even split between the signs of the coefficients of the number of chain hotels and the number of chain rooms. The coefficients of number of hotels, however, were all negative, implying that an inverse relationship exists between the number of chain hotels and TDC. While on balance, this may not seem to be realistic, it bears reiterating that TDC encompasses more than simply what a destination has to offer. An important component is sustainability, and even with more and more hotels becoming focused on becoming more sustainable, the fact remains that traditional hotels can negatively impact the ecosystem of a country because of increased greenhouse emissions and water wastage, among other things. The onus is therefore on governments to monitor the activities of hotels and similar establishments to ensure that their actions align with the sustainability goals of the country. For the case study, the analysis of Sandals in Grenada and its contribution to tourism destination competitiveness showed that the Sandals chain has impacted competitiveness in ways conforming to each of the 4 sub-indices of the TTCI. The hotel has contributed to improving the regulatory environment for tourism businesses through its lobbying of the government, added to the Sustainable Development Agenda through its sustainability initiatives, assisted with ensuring consistent and regular airlift into the country, and indirectly marketed the destination by means of its brand website. All of these serve to improve the competitiveness of Grenada as a tourism destination. However, it was found that the need for vigilant monitoring of the activities of not only the Sandals chain, but all other hotels by the government was also important. Now, in terms of limitations, this research was limited by several factors, but the 2 most important ones were lack of an annual measure of competitiveness of the islands considered, which impacted the power of the regression models, and the lack of data, which in many cases was a serious constraint. And these limitations in turn led to the recommendations of the paper, which were that Future work should be done with regional statistical offices so that they can produce the necessary data for an annual compilation of competitiveness with the goal of inclusion in the TTCI, or that future research focus on formulating an annual index of regional tourism competitiveness, which would be more tailored to address the unique limitations faced by Caribbean data compilers and countries. Also, the need for compilation of tourism satellite accounts was something that came up because none of the EC islands currently compile the tourism satellite accounts, which would go a long way to filling the data gaps that exist. And the final recommendation was that another study with the same objectives of this paper be undertaken, but rather than using a cross-section regression analysis, use a panel data regression to achieve the same objectives. And that is the end of my presentation. I do have an excerpt from the bibliography with the papers that I would have spoken about most during this presentation in case anyone is interested in following up. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Adrienne. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had two very thought-provoking presentations and with much food for thought. I'm sure my director would agree that we are just beaming with pride at our students right now. It is now my pleasure to introduce our discussant, Dr. Keith Nurse, who is no stranger to the SRC family and who has kindly agreed to be our discussant to give some constructive feedback to the students this evening before we go to any Q&A. And let me just note that if you do have any questions for these students or any comments, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. So Dr. Keith Nurse is the outgoing principal of the Sir Arthur Lewis Community College in St. Lucia and the president-elect at the College of Science, Technology, and Applied Arts, Trinidad and Tobago. He has worked as senior economist and advisor on structural policies and innovation at the OECD Development Center in Paris. He's the former WTO chair at the University of the West Indies, as well as a former advisor to the WTO Chairs Program. And he is also the former executive director of the UE Consulting Inc., and of course, of the Srirath Ramphal Center. So Dr. Nurse, it is indeed a pleasure to have you, and over to you for your comments.
Thank you very much, Alicia. Congrats to all. Congrats to Yaniv and the colleagues at the Srirath Ramphal Center. I am really pleased and proud of the initiatives that you all are pursuing in terms of facilitating the academic growth of the students from the Masters in Trade Policy. It's a flagship program at the University of the West Indies, and I think you all have grown from strength to strength. So kudos to all. I'd like to thank Alison and Adrienne for their excellent presentations. Again, I think it is worthy of the center, and I would like to compliment them for their good work. What I want to do is not so much provide a critique per se of their work, as much as to add an additional layer, which maybe helps the papers and the perspectives to be stretched for us to grapple with, I think, what are the core issues at hand in the presentations. I mean, in effect, both papers are grappling with the fact that Caribbean economies are suffering from low levels of competitiveness, weak levels of diversification, if not low levels of diversification, and that in many respects, there's a critical need for us to address these issues. Otherwise, the Caribbean share of global trade, global value added, and so on will continue to plummet. In fact, if you look at the data for the last 3 decades, the Caribbean share of global trade and global value added has indeed been declining, and declining very rapidly. Even in a sector like tourism, which is the mainstay of the Caribbean economy, meaning it accounts for the largest share of employment, export earnings, and GDP contribution. So even in the sector that we are purportedly to be the most competitive in, this sector has seen a significant decline in global shares. So if we take that as the overlying or overarching framework within which to evaluate these two presentations, I want to make a few comments, which I think will help to, push the argument a little bit further. Because I think our colleagues have done well to situate the issues. Their review of the literature is well done. Their understanding of the methodologies, particularly the quantitative as well as the qualitative elements, I think are spot on. So that's not the issue. The real issue is how do we then take these perspectives and these arguments to the next level into policy formulation and policy implementation. So, one of the key things that I'll start with Alison, of course. Industrial policy is a very interesting term. And you were quite correct to identify that it is very much a politically sensitive term. So that's why in some countries, they implement industrial policy, but they don't call it industrial policy. They call it innovation policy. Or if you go to Estonia, they refer to it as technology governance. And what they've done is to bypass the critique of the term industrial policy. And so the other point to be made is that even the countries that are so-called neoliberal, when you look at their actual practice on the ground in their country, they have been utilizing industrial policy in multiple ways. So the United States is probably the best example. So at the governmental level and externally, it proposes a neoliberal agenda, but at home and particularly within each of the states in the United States, they practice industrial policy in a significant way. In fact, many of the states compete with each other to attract businesses and major firms. They also put in place a whole range of incentives, et cetera, et cetera. The third comment I wanted to make in relation to the use of the term industrial policy is that in many respects, industrial policy is not a very restrictive term in the sense that it could be applied to multiple sectors, which you commented on, but in most instances, it references manufacturing. And what's interesting is that manufacturing share of global value added has declined since the 1970s. So whereas in 1970 it accounted for 35 to 40% of global value added, it's now somewhere between 15 and 18% and dropping. What this means is that other so-called elements of the global economy, the services sector, even agriculture and so on, have become more important than manufacturing. So one has to be very careful when talking about industrial policy and referencing or making an association with manufacturing. And I think it is mentioned in paper about things like the sophistication of manufacturing, that these constructs that we've been using are outdated now. Terms like manufacturing, as opposed to services, as opposed to intellectual property, and so on, are completely outdated in terms of understanding how the global economy is being refashioned and so on. So, for example, the fastest area of growth in terms of trade and services is receipts in terms of intellectual property. So that intellectual property is now becoming the key means by which economies are competitive, whether they're in so-called manufacturing or services or whatever. And then fourthly, I would say there's a whole literature, and this now links to the second paper by Adrian. There's a literature that's emerging about industrial policy for the services sector or services innovation. And here we talk about the what's called multiple modal approaches to looking at services. Similarly, we could apply the same principle to manufacturing and agriculture and so on. So that being said, the literature that critiques industrial policy, preferences, a neoliberal agenda of markets and letting markets determine where investment go. I try to steer away from that literature and that discourse because the reality historically is further, couldn't be further from the truth. What do I mean by that? If you read the history, the economic history of countries and sectors, as opposed to reading what economists say, I'm making an important distinction here. Economists make discussions about things like neoliberal policy and industrial policy. But if you go back and you read the literature and the history of particular sectors and particular countries in relation to their economic expansion, they don't get completely tied in to these ideological constructs. And so the issue at hand is that in most countries that have been successful in industrial policy, the private sector has played a critical role. Why? Because it's the private sector that invests to the greatest extent in innovation and R&D and so on, which are really important for promoting industrial policy. And in many instances, it is the private sector that advocates and negotiates and leverages their prowess with the state to determine the government policy. So industrial policy is not just driven by governments. In fact, invariably, it's driven by the private sector. And so private sector and public sector intersection is really critical. The third component to that is that in most successful areas of industrial policy, educational policy is also important. Why? Because if you don't have universities training people at the right level with the right qualifications and engage in R&D in their institutions, then industrial policy just wouldn't happen or materialize. So I want to encourage Alison to think outside of what the literature and the mainstream literature talks about, to think about the history of it, but also the practicality of industrial policy. But her recommendations, I thought, were pointing in the right direction and encouraging us to shift the locus of discussion. So I'll just highlight some of the recommendations that were identified. A monitoring and evaluating mechanism, more than important. Why? Because in most Caribbean countries, we have no data collection in this area. In fact, in some countries, and particularly in Trinidad and Tobago has on the books hundreds of incentives and all kinds of policy mechanisms which nobody can reference or identify or assess whether or not it's been impactful or not. Furthermore, we don't know how much the private sector is spending on research and development. NEHRS used to collect that data. It hasn't been doing so for several years now. And so we really don't know whether we are expanding or in regression in relation to something like research and development spending. So I thought that was a really important example of what needs to be done. The second recommendation that I thought was really important is the notion of a champion, a leader, some entity. So I used to be a member of the Economic Development Advisory Board here in Trinidad and Tobago, which was doing exactly what you've identified and recommended. The harder we pushed to facilitate and encourage industrial policy, the more the state regressed from the idea and eventually disbanded the whole Economic Development Advisory Board. All right. So in a petro state, the Dutch disease phenomenon is not just a factor that relates to the policy environment, it also relates to the way in which the country sees itself, right? And how it sees its future. So in Trinidad and Tobago, we are still hooked on the idea that oil and gas and hydrocarbons are going to be our savior. So irrespective of political party, irrespective of which government's in power, that is the dominant paradigm. And so how do you flip that switch? How do you move from policy formulation to policy implementation? Becomes the real trick that most developing countries haven't figured out. So the issue of a champion is a really important construct that you've raised. The other point you made about linking export strategy with the wider trade policy agenda. Well, you know, at Trade Ramble Center, we've been training people in trade policy for a long time now, and it's the premier institution for doing so in the region. We haven't been training people well enough, I would argue, on things like industrial policy or innovation policy. And so when you go to a Ministry of Trade, they know about maybe some of the trade agreements and the exemptions and the, you know, the, what you call it, restrictive lists and export categories and so on. But how to do what you're suggesting is link export strategy to trade policy is something that we still don't do well enough. So I think that's a really important point. And last but not least, you did mention the area of diaspora. As you know, that's one of my core areas of research. And that's the means by which we expand our market in the Caribbean. Right? The diaspora is an extension of our home market, but also the diaspora is an important co-creator for industrial policy and innovation policy. So I thought those were really important recommendations. So congratulations to you on that, Alison. Let me turn now to Adrian. The tourism sector, as you've indicated, and right on you with this, is a really important driver of the Caribbean economy. And to improve our tourism destination competitiveness, you identified three core areas or issues: economic competitiveness, attractiveness, and satisfaction of the visitors, and sustainability issues. I wanted to suggest a slightly different perspective. I've gone to many tourism conferences and meetings, particularly in the Caribbean and outside of the region. And there is a tourism paradigm, which we refer to as heads in beds and bums in seats. That the thing that we count are tourists, right? How many of them are on the planes and how many of them in the accommodation. What we don't count well enough is the net value added from tourism, for example. And if you do that, the Caribbean, even though it's the most tourism-dependent region in the world, has one of the lowest levels of net value added from tourism. So it doesn't matter how much resources we throw at it. You know? The amount that stays in our economy is very small. Right? The most recent estimates I saw are somewhere between 10 and 15%. Whereas in a country like Costa Rica, it's 50 to 60%. How do we move from where we are at to that, let's say, Costa Rican model, where we have a higher level of domestic value added? So then the issue of competitiveness, right? I'm saying the issue of competitiveness needs to be dissected into more strategic indicators, like what is the net value added? If all the food that the tourists are eating is imported, right? If all of the duty-free things are imported, if all of the management is imported, if all of the ownership is also imported, then in effect, there's no surprise that our competitiveness is so low and shrinking. And that's because, really, besides providing the physical space where the hotels are established, we are providing not much else. So if we don't improve the domestic value added in the tourism experience, then what competitiveness are we talking about? All right, so that's the key point. The second point is this: tourism is multimodal, right? So you guys are well trained on trade and services. So for example, in Barbados, one of the biggest tourism firms is, how or what you call, oh, it's just the top of my head. Yeah, they don't have any hotel. Well, they do have a hotel chain of their own. And one of the few companies in Barbados that owns a hotel chain. But they operate in airports. They provide food in over 120 airports around the world. They are in the tourism industry. Okay. And they are providing export of services. But nobody ever talks about them as being part of the tourism sector. And that's because we're thinking in a stereotypical way that tourism and the tourism industry is about hotels and planes and tourists. In fact, you could have a tourism industry with no tourists arriving on your territory. You could be providing services to a range of entities in the tourism sector and be in the tourism sector and be very competitive. And if you take climate change into account, a country like Barbados needs to move increasingly in this direction because the beaches where most of these hotels are probably going to disappear in the next 50 to 100 years. So Barbados needs to think about what is the next way to be involved in tourism other than beaches on hotels on the beach. Sorry. The other point that I wanted to raise, and this is based on a study that I did for both the Commonwealth Secretariat and the OAS on the accommodation sector in Barbados. The fastest rising area of accommodation in Barbados is not hotels. It's villas, right? The villa share of the market has grown at a rapid rate. It probably accounts for somewhere between 25 and 30% of the accommodation in Barbados. Most of those villas, like the hotels, are foreign-owned. And so the question then arises, well, so what's the strategy going forward for a place like Barbados? Far more for the Eastern Caribbean territories that you referred to in your study. So I also thought that Grenada is a useful case study because we need to talk about the strategy and the marketing as in the competitiveness element. Because just talking about the tourism destination competitiveness doesn't really get you to the point of success in this industry. You have to look at a country like Aruba. Aruba has decided that they're going to brand themselves and structure their whole economy on seeing themselves as the happiest island in the world. And you know what they've done? They've tapped into the happiness industry. I didn't know there was such a thing until I went there to speak at their conference. Their happiness magazines, websites, cookbooks, right? And what they've done is to segue into a very clearly defined stream where they're not competing with anybody else. So the best way to compete is to not compete with anyone. So Grenada is doing a bit of that. Spice Island, Pure Grenada. And one of the biggest sources of income for the tourism industry in Grenada is educational tourism, which accounts for close to 25% of the GDP of Grenada. So what's the strategy? Strategy trumps policy. Policy should be the handmaiden of strategy. Yeah? So I'll leave my comments at that for now, because I know I've probably exhausted my my time. I wanted to comment on the example you use of seeing sandals. I think in a small economy, sandals role is probably outsized. So I think you need to nuance that that as a case study or as an example of a multinational firm playing a critical role in the tourism industry in a small island like Grenada. But there's much more we could talk about in terms of sandals and so on. So all the best. Over to you. Back to the moderator. Best regards.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nurse, for a very, very not just constructive, but methodical and insightful review of the two papers, and the fact that you took the time not just to speak about the papers, but also bring your own perspectives, because as we all know, you've also written extensively on these areas. So it really was a pleasure to have you. And I'm sure Jan would agree, it really was, really, really exciting for us to have you back in this role. So thank you so much for taking the time, because we know you're very busy, but for taking the time to provide these very insightful comments and constructive feedback on ways in which the students could look at these issues in a broader and increasingly more interesting way based on your experience. So thank you so much, Dr. Nurse. We're deeply appreciative. So we have a hard finish at 3:45. So at this time, as much as I would have loved the students to be able to respond, I do have to give my thank yous to everyone on behalf of the center and on behalf of my director. Of course, thank you to our two presenters, Ms. Allison St. Bryce and Mrs. Adrienne Brathwaite Green. We at the SRC are truly proud of you both, and we're very happy that you were able to join us today and share your work. To our discussant, Dr. Keith Nurse, for your very constructive feedback. We're deeply appreciative. Thank you so much for joining us. Our technical support, Mr. Samuel Eugene and his team, Mr. Jamal Innes. To the SRC staff, my director, Dr. Jani Remy. Thank you so much to Neil, who worked with us with regard to the campaign for this. To anyone else who would have contributed, thank you so much. And last but not least, you, the audience, for taking the time out to come, not only for your constant and unwavering support of our SRC events and activities, but to share with us for our first SRC virtual trade series. So thank you to all, and do enjoy the rest of your evening.
Thank you, and thank you, Alicia.
All right. Thank you much, guys.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks, students. Thanks, Keith. Bye, everyone.
Bye,
Join us
everyone.
again for the next one.
So proud of you both.
Yes.
Thank